Good afternoon, everybody. I am Sarah Dash, President and CEO of the Alliance for Health Policy. Welcome to the 9th week of our COVID-19 webinar series. For those who are not familiar with the Alliance, we are a nonpartisan resource for the policy community dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding of health policy issues. We launched this series to provide insight into the status of the COVID-19 response and shed light on remaining gaps in the system that must be addressed to limit the severity in the United States. The Alliance for Health Policy gratefully acknowledges Arnold Ventures, the Commonwealth Fund, and the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation for their support of today's webinar. You can join today's conversation on Twitter using the hashtag AllHealthLive and follow us at AllHealthPolicy. We'd like you to all be active participants in today's webinar, so please get your questions ready. Here's how you ask them. You should see a dashboard on the right side of your web browser with a speech bubble icon. You can use that bubble icon to submit questions that you have for the panelists at any time. We will collect those and address them during the broadcast. You can also use that icon to notify us if you're having any technical issues. Check out our website, allhealthpolicy.org, for background materials and a recording of today's webinar, which will appear within a few hours. The COVID-19 pandemic has shifted the landscape of the pharmaceutical supply chain conversation. Global demand for products needed to treat patients with COVID-19 have strained the system, and disruptions to manufacturing have drawn national attention to vulnerabilities in the supply chain. Today, our panelists will explore the impact of COVID-19 on different facets of the drug supply chain and weigh policy options to strengthen the system. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by an all-star lineup. First, we have Erin Fox, who is the Senior Pharmacy Director of Drug Information and Support Services for the PGY2 Drug Information Residency at University of Utah Healthcare. Erin is a nationally recognized drug shortages and supply chain expert. Next, we'll hear from Tom Cosgrove, who is a partner at Covington & Burling. Previously, he held several senior-level positions in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration. Next, we will hear from Dr. Nicolette Lewis-Saint, who is the Executive Director of Healthcare Ready, an organization dedicated to strengthening healthcare supply chains during national emergencies. Previously, Dr. Lewis-Saint worked for the Department of State, where she oversaw issues related to health intellectual property, trade issues, and the 2014 Ebola response. And finally, we're pleased to have Dr. Rena Conti, who is the Associate Research Director of Biopharma and Public Policy at Boston University's Institute for Health System Innovation and Policy. Thank you all for joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Erin Fox for opening remarks. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. So if we go to the first graphic, I'd like to set the stage and make sure everyone is aware that drug shortages have been a long-standing problem in the U.S. These are data that my team and I track. We publish these at the American Society of Health System Pharmacists public website. Just to orient you to this graphic, on each bar shows the number of brand new shortages that occurred during that calendar year. So you can see that we've had, quite a variety of numbers of drug shortages, but we've been fairly high recently. And even into the first quarter of this year, we've already had 49 brand new drug shortages. And if we look at the next slide, you can see that this is on top of active and ongoing shortages. Just because a shortage begins in one calendar year doesn't mean that it ends in that same calendar year. Many of these drug shortages linger on and are problematic. And so you can see, we're almost back up into that 300 active and ongoing shortage range. So this is something that hospitals and health systems and pharmacies are dealing with on a daily basis. And to add additional shortages on top of this is really quite difficult. So if we go to the next slide, just making sure that people understand that this is not something that is an easy fix. Especially with the pandemic, we've had unprecedented demand because of the surge of patients. So we see the worsening drug shortages of many of these products that were already in short supply to begin with. We didn't come from a whole place. We had shortages of fentanyl and midazolam and many of the paralytics already going into this. And so dealing with a very, very large surge of patients has really strained the pharmaceutical supply chain. And what's unusual is most shortages are actually due to manufacturing problems and poor quality. And so we're in an unusual state of shortages right now, dealing with shortages that are due to some quality problems, but also dealing with shortages that are due to that increased demand. And I have to just make sure everyone is aware that patients are harmed by these poor quality products. The warnings that manufacturers get from FDA are not just minor infractions. In many cases, patients have definitely been harmed. Earlier this week, there was a great health affairs blog by Janet Woodcock, and really the message there is that we must improve medication quality. So if we go to the next slide, what are some ideas to fix this problem? This is actually not a very new idea. We've been talking about quality and improving quality to improve our shortage state for years. This quote is from a paper from 2014, and really to eradicate shortages, we have to improve manufacturing quality. So what are some ways to do that? Right now, there is absolutely no requirement for a drug company to disclose even which company made the final dosage form or the factory or where it came from. All of that is in a black box and is considered to be a proprietary secret. That lack of transparency makes it extraordinarily difficult to follow the quality data. We know that FDA sees very different levels of quality between manufacturers and products, but those are not disclosed publicly. We simply have a pass-fail system, but FDA sees very clear delineations, even a grading system. The A+ factories are very different from the C- D+ factories, and yet all of those products are lumped together and on the market available for patients. One way to help with this is to really provide public quality ratings that will allow payers and even patients to reward those companies that have higher quality products. I know that I would rather purchase higher quality products for our hospital system. They're going to be much less likely to be on recall, much less likely to go on shortage, and it's worth it to have those higher quality products. We're not going to have patients harmed from contaminated products. We need these quality ratings. These are something that was suggested even from FDA's Drug Shortages Task Force. And so I hope that we can all focus certainly on getting through this pandemic, getting through the surge, but at the end of the day, if we truly want to fix this problem, we have to do something to improve quality. And I will turn over the time to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Erin. I just want to ask you really quickly as a follow-up before we turn to Tom. In your slide where you showed shortages kind of dipping down and then dipping back up, to what do you attribute that decline in shortages and then the more recent increase kind of before COVID?
So, that dip down, in the 2013, 2014 era, honestly, we had so many drug shortages in 2010, 2011 that were still lingering. It was almost as if there weren't more drugs to go on shortage. That was a very, very extremely difficult time. We had rationing of pediatric oncology treatments during that time. We had at least 30% of manufacturing closed in the United States during that time, and so the number of new shortages wasn't really quite keeping pace. As factories improved, things started to get a little better as well. We also saw FDA's notification requirements go into effect. So really before 2011, drug companies didn't have to tell the FDA if they were going to have a shortage or not. That became law in 2012 with the FDASIA law. And so that notification helps the FDA try to prevent shortages from happening in the first place. And so that's another reason why we've seen lower numbers since then.
Great. Thanks so much for that clarification. Please now to turn the mic over to Tom Cosgrove. Tom, go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the organization for having me. And I also want to encourage everyone out there, as soon as you possibly can, come be a panelist, because the clock will be turned back on your aging for about 20 years. I think my assistant must have sent in the wrong headshot. This is me right out of law school 21 years ago. So if you come, you get to turn back the clock too. Um, so since this young man graduated from college, law school, had a long career in FDA, and now I'm a partner at Covington and Burling. And let me just sort of start off with a few remarks. First of all, the comments just before I think are incredibly important to think about. And one of the things I worry about when it comes to public markers of drug quality is what is it that you're measuring. Some of the best companies and some of the highest quality companies are actually very transparent with FDA and sort of are very rigorous about tracking manufacturing deviations, correcting manufacturing deviations, and making sure that the agency understands where they are with things. And it's important to think about how would that phenomenon actually track forward into a public rating system. Some of the companies that we have most concern about, they actually don't honestly track their manufacturing issues, and therefore it's a lot harder to fit them into a metric system that would be public and kind of used for consumers. Anyway, I would say, FDA is always in the crosshairs between innovation and safety and that balance. And I think we're seeing that more and more now. And sort of right in between those two issues, innovation and safety, are drug access issues. And if we think about FDA's core functions, we have drug review and compliance, what should be on the market, and how does FDA kind of enforce those standards. But how do those two things now come together to help facilitate safe drugs being on the market and avoiding shortages? Right now, of course, FDA and industry are moving at breakneck speed to bring new drugs to market. And one question is, how will these new products exist along already existing medical products? If it's true that we'll need 1 billion new vials next year for a vaccine if it's approved, where will those vials come from? So industry and FDA are working together on questions like that to help ensure there aren't shortages for existing products, and that we can ramp up production of new drugs and new drugs for COVID-19 specifically as quickly as possible. I think one of the things I'm here to talk about is how does FDA and industry work together to sort of communicate shortages and to avoid shortages. As a lot of people know, there's a vigorous and very active FDA drug shortages staff that engages with industry and to try to head off shortages whenever possible. And actually, this has been quite successful. Although there are still too many shortages, we find, those have been much better tracked, better understood, and there's better opportunities for remediation now. So I think I'll leave it at that. I think there's a lot of great questions on the agenda for today, and look forward to hearing from the moderator, hearing from you all, and again, sign up so that you can turn the clock back 20 years.
Thanks so much, Tom. Well, we're the fountain of youth over here, so appreciate you joining us and sharing your experience. Next, we're pleased to hear from Nicolette Louis-Saint. Nicolette, take it away.
Hello, depending on your time zone, good morning or good afternoon. I don't know that the time, gods were in my favor on this, but I am certainly glad to be with you all today. Thank you for raising this very important conversation and pulling together a breadth of perspectives on this. And as I am also enjoying the speakers, I'm very much looking forward to questions from the attendees and learning more in that discussion as well. So with that, I'm happy to turn to the next slide and discuss a little bit about just who we are and what we do. Healthcare Ready is a rather unique partner in this supply chain space. We were actually created as a public-private partnership by the supply chain specifically the associations from the end-to-end supply chain, recognizing that there needed to be a partner in place to serve as a coordinator and information sharer, to make sure that information was being shared, not just across the supply chain in crisis, but as we're thinking about and building preparedness plans. And taking that a step further, recognizing that, as Tom mentioned, the next extension of how the supply chain works with one another is how they work with government. And oftentimes we think about the relationship between the supply chain and government as being the FDA, but there are a lot of additional components of that relationship that need to be in place, especially in these issues of supply chain continuity during disasters. And so our role is to really serve as that linkage point, to serve as that coordinator, both in peacetime and in times of strain. And on the next slide, I'll just begin to talk through kind of how we see this. So during COVID, we are looking at it from multiple vantage points. One of the things that's very important to us as we continue to do this work is to really think about the entire supply chain. Some of the conversation around supply chain resilience is focused on sometimes a specific component of the supply chain, which is not really the entire thing. Or sometimes we're focused on the availability of a single product in a single location. And it may be that the product is available, but it may not be in that location, which is more of a movement issue rather than an overall availability issue. And so we are looking at the entire landscape. We are not just thinking about what it looks like to ramp up production of products, but there, I've heard a lot of folks talk about the national supply chain. When you think about the health supply chain globally for the US and other countries, there is really no such thing as a national supply chain. It is a global supply chain. So when we're thinking about product that needs to be created, manufactured, developed, it also has to be moved. And so it's not enough to just make more product. We do have to make sure that that product is able to, through the logisticians that are across the supply chain, the distributors that are moving product, be able to move that product through what we like to call the middle mile. So a lot of our focus is there, and then coordinating with the federal government and also state governments on this issue, because again, at the end of the day, we have to make sure that the coordination that needs to happen can happen so that available products can get to those facilities that need it most, and then making sure that we are working with our healthcare partners so that as we are getting visibility across the supply chain, we're also beginning to get a better picture of demand and things that may shift demand. Because when we're talking about an event like COVID, we're going to be at ahistorical demand levels. And so the more visibility we're getting on demand and the better a demand projection we get for where we anticipate being in the short term as well as the long term, that helps to make sure that that partnership across the supply chain can absorb that information and begin to consider strategies to react to it. On the next slide, I just wanted, this is one of my favorite slides. It is busy and I apologize, but I did want to just give a picture of the current operating picture from our vantage point, because for an organization like Healthcare Ready, when we talk about the supply chain, we are really talking about every piece of it, which for us, we think about finished product supply chain mostly, which means we are less in the raw material space. We track those things. We are thinking about the vials and all of those elements, but our real focus is thinking through the process of getting to finished product and then the movement of that finished product, which means that every component of the supply chain has to be a primary consideration for us, ultimately serving patients. So for us in COVID, it's understanding at the manufacturing level, continuity of operations. There was a lot of discussion early on about, early on in the COVID outbreak, about the Chinese New Year and the lag in production that was related to that, and then the workforce disruptions. Thinking about how critical product is being surged, and if there are trade-offs that have to be made in order to make the product that is most necessary right now for COVID, and what the implications of that may be in the midterm. understanding also how to allow for the R&D trials to be able to continue and what that means for production of other product. On the distribution side, we've had massive challenges being able to get product because of customs issues in other countries, getting product into the US, but also other parts of the economy. As we're seeing passenger planes begin to decrease, a lot of finished product moves on those planes and the bellies of those planes. So if we're not able to have flights continuing to move from Europe and Asia into the US, it's been very constraining to be able to maintain the consistent flow of product. And then making sure that at the end of the day, workforce protection, provider protection, and communication so that we can really have a picture of demand and be able to respond to it is all very critical for us. So with that, I'm happy to stop my remarks. The next slide just has additional information about how to think through some of these concerns. I know there's a lot to really unpack here. I do want to draw your attention to the bottom right, because as we're thinking through the supply chain and understanding components of the supply chain as it relates to COVID, we also have to understand that we are no longer in a system where we're allowed to think about one disaster or one strain of the system at a time. And so as we are responding to COVID, we also have to think about the upcoming hurricane season, which is about 2 weeks away, as well as flu season. This is normally the time where we would be preparing for flu season and production ramp ups and other adjustments would be happening. And we've not had the ability to do that. So it's not enough for us to just think about the pandemic response. We also have to think about the other things that are on the horizon.
Next Thank slide, you please. So much. And Nicolette, let me actually ask you to go back to that slide for just a second, because that's a really helpful slide. Can you give us a window, as far as people who are in this business, whether from the business side, the industry side, or the government side, like how do you even begin to start to prioritize, to think through, how to manage all of these really incredibly important concerns? Can you just give us a little bit of a window into kind of how that might take place?
Sure. So I think the true answer is that you try to prioritize them all, but different parts of the supply chain may be more acutely focused on parts of these issues because they have a bigger role to play. For example, if we're thinking about movement challenges, logistical issues, even international movement down to the last mile, you're going to see distributors be a lot more involved in that, as well as being able to build a clearer demand picture. We see distributors and GPOs working really hard with one another, as well as with health systems, to be able to understand not just availability of product, which is something that distributors have a really clean picture into, but also demand, because one of the challenges that we do run into in a time like this is that we may see over ordering or panic buying. It's the same thing that many of us are doing on Amazon right now. It manifests in thinking about how you are ordering products that you anticipate having a legitimate need for should the demand or should the number of cases continue to increase. But that may not actually result in true demand. So you'll see that distributors, for example, have a role there. And then you'll also see that from our vantage point, we're thinking about how to marry up that demand picture with thinking about visibility and manufacturing resilience. And that's an upstream part of the system. And so in some ways, the policies that we are thinking about advancing have to include all of these components, and that's why it has to be so nuanced, because it truly is complicated. But on the other side, we have to think about how to make sure that we're integrating partnerships, because there are different parts of the supply chain that are going to be so integral in being able to really build what is the true vision of resilience for the end-to-end supply chain.
Thank you. Let's now turn to Rina Conti for your presentation, and then we'll get even more into the audience Q&A. And just as a reminder to folks, if you do have a question, feel free to go ahead and send it in now. Send as many as you like. We'll do our best to get to them during the conversation. Rina, go ahead.
Yes, hello all, and thank you so much for the Alliance and also this all-star panel. I am an economist, and for the better part of the past 2 decades, I've studied the supply chain and of these drugs and their implications for pricing and also demand. I'm going to show you some facts related to foreign supply and other issues in this market that really do matter for formulating policy response. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So first, very important fact to know is that competition among these drugs, in other words, the number of suppliers making the workforce of all products needed in the US is actually quite limited. More than 60% of all drugs in the US, I'm so sorry, there's a lawnmower or something going on in the background. I have no control over that. But more than 60% of all drugs sold in the U.S. have 1 or 2 suppliers, and supply is even more constrained when you get into those non-oral products that are commonly used in the hospital setting. And the other thing that you should note here is that these are shares of units. So these are actually volume adjusted counts of suppliers over the past decade. Next slide, please. In some sense, this very constrained supply is not a surprise in that from our work, we can see that the median drug sold in the US is only making for the manufacturer $1 million per quarter or $4 million per year. So in addition to just the therapeutic obsolescence that happens, many of the manufacturers of generic drugs that are used commonly really aren't real money makers for their manufacturers. Next slide, please. Now, there's also a significant amount of slippage when we want to go ahead and count manufacturers or identify who the manufacturer is in the supply chain. So there are really 3 different potential manufacturers that matter. The first is the manufacturer of the base ingredients. The second is the manufacturer of the fill and finish or the actual drug product. And then lastly is the contract manufacturer. So the entity that holds the license to make that product from the FDA's perspective can also contract out to another manufacturer to make either those base ingredients or those fill and finish products. Next slide, please. So the FDA has very graciously given myself and colleagues data on where the base ingredients, API, and the fill and finish or drugs are made from 2014 onwards. I'm going to show you the last data that we have. And what you should really note here is that overwhelmingly, the base ingredients, those APIs, are made in the foreign setting, in the non-US setting. There is drug supply that is being made in the US that is largely being made in the Sun Belt or in pretty weather-prone areas in the southeastern United States. When we move to the fill and finish drugs, those are the actual drugs that we consume, yes, there is US supply. We are highly reliant on China and maybe even more importantly on India. There's one other thing that's very important to note. When you see these statistics, the statistics that come from the Food and Drug Administration, or the statistics that are coming from many other consultants that are wandering around Washington right now talking about the foreign reliance on supply, none of those statistics are volume adjusted. In other words, I can't tell you what the share of products, units sold into the US, are coming from China, India, or Italy. All I can tell you is the count of manufacturers and where they are delivered. Next slide, please. As many of my colleagues have already noted, hospitals generally are going it alone in identifying supply for these products. They are meeting a very complex supply chain, which includes brokers such as group purchasing organizations. Next slide, please. The current procurement issues are facing very significant challenges when there's worldwide demand for certain hospital-based products, meeting very fragile and increasingly fragile supply for particularly these non-oral drugs that are used in the hospital setting. And I'll just note here that really the hospitals and states are reporting encountering a bewildering set of procurement rules, which include export and import restrictions and many shady middlemen and also shoddy products. And I would say trade here and customs is its own special circle of hell for those who are charged by their hospitals and trying to go and find out procure certain types of products. Next slide, please. The policy responses layered on top of hospitals and states going alone are largely rooted in a political philosophy of federalism. And here I'm just going to simply highlight Buy American as being really the Trump administration's bandying call, if you will, for going out and getting these products. But frankly, that is largely non-actionable for many of these products that are solely manufactured overseas. And for which these kind of bewildering array of trade rules apply. And even if we did Buy American, it would take many years to actually implement, and it would likely raise significant costs. Next slide. I echo Erin's concerns related to transparency across the entire supply chain. Next slide, please. And I'll end with 3 suggested reforms. The first is, again, much more increased transparency on drug supply chains, which include the identity of the manufacturer, their volume, and the actual products being made in specific places. Secondly, I would say there is a role for American supply. There is also a role for increased trade talks and other product securement with our allies. But that needs to be very targeted to specific products. And I would even argue stronger that we might want to focus on specific types of supply of base ingredients and manufacturing capacity for certain types of essential products that one might even consider to be ones of national security. And one thing that people haven't mentioned yet, but is certainly worth some consideration, is not only might we want to increase supply of some of these products or secure supply of some of these products, but we might also want to assure stable demand. And that might include, instead of going these boom and bust cycles of wanting these products, and then the supply chain responding in a just-in-time setting, instead we might want to have some requirements for the hospitals to hold extra reserves of supplies that could be deployed to kind of smooth out some of the surges in demand if needed. And then lastly, there are no federal price gouging rules, only state price gouging rules. And this has been a serious concern among the hospitals and other people trying to procure these products, facing, again, middlemen who are really trying to take advantage of American need in a time of peril. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rena. All right, so thank you to all of you. You've shared a real breadth and depth of information on the supply chain issues. So now is our chance to get into some deeper Q&A. So again, to our audience, if you want to go ahead and use that question mark button, send us a question. I'd like to start by kind of just going a little deeper into characterizing the supply shortages themselves. And we have a question from the audience about whether quality and shortage issues differ across brand, generic, and biologics or specialty drugs. And Rena, let's start with you just because you spent a fair amount of time talking about kind of the generic market. Can you start with that question, and then we'll see if others on the panel would like to chime in.
Absolutely outstanding question. Yes. So in general, brand, small molecule, and biologic-based products have dual or even triple sourced supply chains, both for the base ingredients and also for the fill and finish products. And so the fragility of the supply chain is much less of an issue for those products. The concern is really in the generic small molecule or biologic-based products. Think insulin and antibiotics and pain medications, which are largely coming through foreign supply chains, and or even if they're not, the base ingredients are being made overseas and then shipped to the U.S. for packaging and kind of completion. In many of those products, there is simply one supplier, and that one supplier is in China or India and is facing their own export restrictions, their own surge in supply or surge in demand for their own populations. That's diverting American capacity to access these products.
And this might be a really super basic question, but let's say there's that one supplier. Does that mean they have one factory, one location, or would it be multiple locations where ingredients or medicines are being made? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, great question. We don't know. I mean, that's a simple answer because there is no transparency over dual supply or multiple supply for the base ingredients or the fill and finish products in the generic space. The only entities that know are the manufacturers themselves, and the manufacturers in the U.S., again, are facing a highly international, complex supply chain. So you have to kind of go individual drug by individual drug to actually answer that question. And again, it's not as obvious, even for the folks who are selling these products, as it should be. And I would say the other thing is that, again, particularly for these base ingredients, they're commodity products. They are manufactured by companies that don't make a lot of money on them. They know they have advantage by being sole supplier in the world, and they take advantage of that. They do not face incentives to manufacture for quality, and they certainly do not face incentives to ensure additional capacity in the case of weather events or a pandemic or other types or trade wars, for example.
All right, thanks for that answer. Erin, Tom, or Nicolette, would you like to add anything to that? Kind of how do we sort of start to characterize the differences in terms of what drugs are being impacted? And, perhaps if one of you might kind of jump in as well and talk about, in addition to the differences between sort of the generic brand, biologic specialty drugs, just give a little bit more color, a little more data around sort of COVID-related drugs and those for people who maybe are not impacted by COVID, but obviously have other healthcare needs. Are we talking just the drugs for really people with really serious conditions? Are we talking drugs like people take on a daily basis? Let me just kind of, for the sake of being orderly, kind of see if Erin wants to take a start at that, and then see if others want to answer.
Thanks so much. Rena's answer was brilliant. And so just to add on, the typical drug that we see in short supply year over year, month after month, is a generic injectable. And Many of the same products that we have in short supply right now that are related to COVID, a lot of those are injectables. A lot of those are needed not only to help maintain patients on ventilators in the ICUs, but also these are the same drugs that we need to do elective surgeries and some of the procedures. And so as states are opening back up and hospitals are maybe no longer facing a huge surge of patients, but are wanting to start back on some of the elective procedures, it's a tightrope walk to try to make sure that you have enough propofol and dexmedetomidine and fentanyl and midazolam, not only for your ICU patients, but also so that you can restart some of those elective surgeries and care for patients that may have been putting off care during this pandemic time. Some of the patients everyday medications may be affected right now as well. We've definitely seen shortages of albuterol inhalers. Part of that is every hospital normally uses a nebulizer treatment, which is like a mist that you breathe in. Normally, this is a very inexpensive and very effective way to help give a hospitalized patient a breathing treatment. However, it's not a good idea if you've got an infectious agent because it could potentially be an aerosolizing procedure. And so during this pandemic, hospitals on a dime had to all switch to going to using more inhalers. That really stressed the system, and we saw a lot of shortages of those inhalers. FDA has done some approvals during this time, and things do seem to be easing up. But, patients could be going to their pharmacy and maybe not being able to fill a prescription or maybe get as many inhalers as they normally would.
All right, thank you. And Nicolette, you talked a lot about the need for data on demand and to really figure out kind of what people need when, and maybe asking if you would like to comment on, as hospitals maybe start to reopen to elective procedures or non-emergency procedures, I should say, how do you see that playing out?
Sure. So I think one of the challenges that we have is how hospitals or states really begin to work together to prioritize those non-emergency procedures. So what we do know is that in the current system, for the volume of surge in demand and the type of surge in demand, it was going to strain the system. Similarly, I think if we are not careful and intentional about how we resume those non-emergency functions, those non-emergency procedures, we could see the same thing. So from our vantage point, it's a few things that are all coming into play at the same time. One is tracking reopening procedures, and as states are making decisions, or counties in some cases are making decisions about their reopening plans, we do have to consider how those reopenings are going and whether or not that's going to cause another surge of COVID cases and what that means for the medicines that need to be available for those patients, as well as those non-emergency procedures. So there are a few things, and as I mentioned in my talk, also considering hurricane season. So when you are thinking about those who are directly impacted by a hurricane, you're also going to see a surge in acute care needs. So, and those all may require different types of product, but it all could strain the system in various ways. So that's how we're thinking about it. Also trying to really get a good sense of how to resolve some of these logistics challenges internationally, so that product that is finished in Asia, in Europe, can actually get into the US. That is critical for us. So making sure that we do have the ability to also allow for customs procedures and other things to not impede our ability to get that finished product in.
Oh, Tom, hi. Sorry, I apologize to everybody. I made a rookie mistake. I was on mute. I wanted to ask Tom Cosgrove about who is actually responsible for monitoring and reporting drug shortages and other disruptions in the supply chain. And could you share a little bit more depth as far as kind of how exactly that information gets shared? And then if you would, maybe just give a little bit of more insight into, are there new technologies that are helping? Is blockchain or AI, a new kind of source of information around drug shortages? Go ahead and take a stab at that if you would.
Sure, thanks. I was going to jump in, but I wasn't sure if I had lost the call. So thank you. Before I start, I think I just want to echo the comments from before about what I think are driving the majority of shortages, which is sort of generic complex products. And we've seen that from kind of year in, year out. From my time at FDA, it was really the sterile injectables that were subject to intense price competition, moving to foreign manufacturing sites and having poor quality, which raised the issues. What's really interesting right now is that we're not seeing large-scale supply disruptions, because of COVID. Actually, the international drug supply chain is holding up quite well. We see some of the same problems that have existed before. But to your question, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are requirements in the law that companies need to communicate their potential drug shortages to FDA. And I think there was a time many years ago when companies could drop out, or there might even be enforcement actions taken by FDA that could inadvertently lead to shortages. And that's really not the case anymore. For at least the last 7 years, FDA has been very sensitive to shortages, and I think tunes its actions quite well to sort of prevent them. If FDA finds out about a looming drug shortage, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to go out and talk to competitors to see if they can scale up, to see if they can fill the gap. And this even goes so far as to, from time to time, exercising enforcement discretion so that drugs from overseas can be brought in to fill the supply gap. Now, it's I think a situation where FDA does have more information than it's allowed to let on, but I think that's for very, very good reason. Companies, these are proprietary supply chains, and companies fight very hard to be competitive and to try to, frankly, stay in business. If the details of all of their commercial arrangements were to be laid out, that would provide some very difficult situations commercially. It might actually lead to a lack of competition and a disruption of the supply chain eventually. So FDA is collecting this information, and it'll put on the website and communicate to the public if there's a situation where a company can't meet the demand and will stock out. Are there new technologies coming into play? I guess I can say that companies themselves, particularly on the branded side, one of the reasons you're not really seeing shortages is because they are very technically sophisticated in both multi-sourcing, projecting out their supply needs, and reacting accordingly. So I think within companies, you're seeing an increased level of sophistication, at least on the brand side. I don't think this is quite yet making its way to FDA in the way FDA communicates or collects information, but I think that's a real opportunity for growth and change in the future.
Great, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to Tom's comments that I agree that FDA is doing an absolutely admirable job in unprecedented situation, and really the work that has been done on the shortage task force really has put the administration in a really, really good position to handle these short-term issues. However, it is really important to note that the FDA was having issues securing enough workforce to do the inspections for existing and new facilities before the pandemic started. And inspections have also been halted at both domestic and foreign suppliers in the wake of the COVID crisis. And again, making sure that FDA has the resources they need to continue to do an outstanding job is going to be an incredibly important job of both the administration and also Congress. And I guess the only other thing I would say is that it has been the industry's position that the location of product manufacturing and the quantities of product manufacturing is a trade secret. And I would argue, considering this ongoing issue related to shortages, particularly among essential medications, that presumption actually puts a lot of stress on our system across many different players and might need to be reconsidered.
And if
Let me
I
ask
could
if
just
anyone else
jump
would
in,
like to.
I
Yeah.
actually would like to. No, I think Erin and Tom made great points, and I agree. And I think one of the other parts that we have to think about is the amount of resilience or flexibility we expect from the commercial supply chain versus the capacity that we expect the federal government to hold. And so, you know, from our vantage point, we often think about the, from Healthcare Ready's vantage point, we think about the normal supply chain and the disaster supply chain. But there are many conversations about the role of the Strategic National Stockpile right now. And I think when you're considering an event of this nature, there is going to be a point at which we have to think about the additional redundancies and the way in which that the SNS or other tools could be used to create additional resilience in the system, whether that is having the ability to hold additional product, having the ability to rotate that through a vendor managed inventory or expanding those capabilities. But we have to put everything on the table. And I think that is a very important consideration to include right now, because even with the amount of visibility that the FDA has, if we do not create changes in the other side of that resiliency, which is the other parts of the federal government and the ways in which they can play a role in building in resiliency in the interest of national security through the SNS and other tools, we're still going to be in a position where we are reacting and not being proactive.
Thanks. And in the last,
sorry.
No, go ahead. I wanted to get in the last 10 minutes into these policy questions. Go ahead, Rena.
Yeah, thank you. I just couldn't agree more with Nicolette that this is both, again, we need to smooth out supply and demand for many of these products and send a signal that to the manufacturers that we need assured supply at a specific level of quality in order to get the system really working in normal times and specifically as we move into the chronic phase of this crisis.
And
Great,
this is
thanks.
Tom. I have to say, if I could say one thing, I couldn't agree with that more. But one of the challenges, and I think it sort of really hampers the debate on this, is that in some cases, especially with generics, it means that maybe people are paying too little for generic drugs, right? It maybe there's too much price competition. Drugs are too cheap, and therefore we find ourselves in single supplier situations. Query whether our political system is really ready to have that conversation as to whether the prices of some drugs should actually go up. So it's something I think about a lot. Very, very interesting point.
And Rena, you kind of talked about ensuring that there's some reserves of drug supply, or I forget exactly how you phrased it, but would that get to a little bit of what Tom is saying, just kind of guaranteeing that there's sort of a purchaser there for those drugs?
Exactly. So what manufacturers care about is revenue, price times quantity. So we can continue to pay relatively low prices if we assure more quantity guarantee to these manufacturers, or alternatively, we can raise the price that we're willing to pay. And I suspect we're going to have to do both to assure high quality products for many of the products that we're talking about. I think that Tom made an incredibly important and nuanced point. It's not just about paying more, it's about really reforming the way in which we reimburse some of these products currently. So many of these products that are used in the inpatient setting are bundled with other medical care. And that really makes the system very price sensitive for these products. If we unbundled these products from the bundle and let them have a price that's floated on actual market conditions, that might also help relieve some pressure here.
And this is Erin. I think the other thing around the pricing issue is, drug shortages cost so much in labor and time and hardship. I would actually pay a little bit more at our hospital system to be assured a quality supply of something that's not going to be recalled and not going to be on shortage. I just don't want to pay more for a product without some kind of an assurance of quality, and that's what we don't have right now. The pass-fail system isn't working.
All right, we have a few minutes left, and we've actually gotten a few questions in from our listeners here about the global supply chain and the impact of Buy American. So I want to spend a couple minutes on that. There's been legislation in the Senate to ban federal payment for any drug manufactured in China. And can you talk, Rena? You talked a little bit about this, so I want to maybe start with Nicolette. What are the trade-offs of increasing domestic production of drugs versus global? How do you see that playing out?
Sure. I think our my co-panelists have raised this already around the pricing. I think one thing that is often forgotten is that we did not get into a highly globalized supply chain by chance. And there are both economic and environmental reasons that we got here. And we often do not talk about the EPA regulations that would need to be adjusted to increase production in the United States, especially of a large volume of products. It's one thing to think about, a handful of products and increasing resiliency, but if we're really talking about moving the bulk of the supply chain, we really have to get into issues of workforce capacity, having a STEM workforce, being able to actually create that type of infrastructure where we would put those facilities, and then the environmental considerations and the regulations that may be a hindrance to enabling that type of production domestically. So it is complex. I think there is agreement that there can and should be more that's done to consider ways in which we can bring parts of those supply chains back to the U.S. in the interest of national security as well as economic security. But there are other considerations that we have to consider. And first, in my mind, the pricing pieces are definitely there, but also we have to think about those environmental regulations and whether we would be comfortable rolling those back in the interest of production, which is something that I don't often hear in the policy discussions.
Thanks for another dimension.
I completely agree with Nicolette. And I think that there are real environmental rules that would restrain, if not completely prohibit, the American manufacture of many of these products. And there's no economic reason why we cannot rely on our trade partners to continue to supply these products at adequate levels and at adequate quality. But that entails trade relationships with our allies that put both quality and also assured supply as being really important shared objectives. That would be a different direction than where we have gone with trade policy to date related to these products.
And, this is Erin. I just do want to add that we do have domestic plants made for many injectable products, and that hasn't gone so well over the years. We've had significant quality problems there, significant shortages. So just buying American or manufacturing in America doesn't prevent us from having shortages, and it doesn't always guarantee a higher level of quality.
All right, thank you. I just want to ask, maybe I'll pinpoint Rena here really quick because we do have a kind of wonky question around the role of consolidation in the wholesaler or PBM marketplace, and we had another question around what role can PBMs play in dealing with supply shortages. So I wonder if you could just spend briefly kind of touch on that question before we move to our final question.
Sure, thank you. Largely the products that are not, largely the products that are at risk are not moving through the PBM system. They're actually moving through the GPO, Group Purchasing Organization system. So it's slightly different, but pretty much the same in terms of function for these products. There are a number of issues that could be resolved here. The first is, again, assurances of quality. The second is potentially reform of failure supply contracts. So right now, the GPOs basically have it out in their contracts. If they can't supply the product to the hospital that needs it, it's on the hospital to figure it out. And there's a significant amount of transparency that the hospitals couldn't really go figure it out if they wanted to. And so reforming the GPO contract so that they actually have a fiduciary duty to demand quality assurance, but also supply assurance would really go a long way here. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. Well, we're unfortunately already out of time, but I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and just go like 2 more minutes because I really want to ask each of you a final question, which is obviously we're still very much in the midst of a crisis. But as Nicolette pointed out, we're looking at a flu season, we're looking at hurricane season in the short term, and then we know that in the long term there will be other natural disasters or supply chain disruptions. So very briefly, if each of you could go through and just share, what do you think is like the top thing that needs to be done to shore up our supply chain for the future? And we'll just go in reverse speaking order, if that's all right. Rena, we'll start with you.
Oh, I'll yield my time to my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay. Nicolette, do you want to start?
I think we need to be talking about the replenishment of the SNS. We do know there's a lot of focus right now on what is happening in the commercial supply chain. There are a lot of adjustments being made, discussions about ramping up production of not just the pharmaceutical components, but the medical surgical components and the raw materials that are necessary. But I've not seen as many discussions about not just SNS replenishment, but composition of the products that are in the SNS. And as we are approaching, we're only 5 months into a very busy year already. As we're approaching hurricane season and other critical events, I think we need to be looking at what our stockpiles have and determining if we need to make adjustments to what's in them.
Thanks. Tom?
Well, I could list a bunch of things, but let me pick the top couple. I think right now, of course, the points that were made earlier about resourcing FDA are really important. I think we depend on the international supply chain, and it has to work. What would it take the supply chain to come all the way back to the US? Well, it's simple. It would take decades and billions. It's the supply chain we're stuck right now. We need to empower FDA to make it work. Beyond that, in the COVID era, we really need to start thinking about how to expedite scale up of manufacturing quickly. And FDA has a role to play in that, as does industry. And I think discussions are starting. But we're going to have a situation soon where we have a few vaccines and a few therapeutics, and literally billions of people are going to want them. And I don't know if the industry is prepared to deliver that, given that it takes maybe 3 to 5 years to significantly scale up an operation. That's the big challenge. With the right kind of engagement between FDA and industry, I think we can meet the challenge, but it's going to require new ways of thinking, literally for all parties involved.
Great, thanks. And Erin, we'll give you the final word.
I couldn't agree more with Nicolette and Tom's comments. I will just add that during this time, we should be thinking more about national strategies for rationing products. I will tell you that the remdesivir allocations are extraordinarily difficult without national guidance on who should actually get the product. Hospitals are faced with developing these criteria on their own. We're lucky we have an academic medical center with an ethics committee and lots of very smart people, but each hospital is on their own. You may get an allocation of 4 doses or 8 doses. How are you going to decide? We're going to have other therapies and other products, even vaccine. How are we going to decide who gets vaccine? So I do want people to start thinking about a national strategy for allocating scarce resources as well.
Thank you. Well, you have all given us a lot of insight into the supply chain, as well as raised some really interesting and important issues for future conversations. So I want to thank all of you. I want to thank our audience for listening in. And again, you can check out allhealthpolicy.org for the recording. Thanks again to Arnold Ventures, the Commonwealth Fund, the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation for making this discussion possible. And Erin, Nicolette, Rena, and Tom, thank you all for joining us. This concludes the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.